Good evening, folks. This is The Weird Part, and I am your host, Vincent Treewell. I have a very special guest tonight, Clay Vandiver, and he is both an investigator and a researcher, and he has some things that I think we will find very interesting. Um, please take it away, Clay. Tell us what you're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, Vincent, it's an honor and a pleasure to be on your show.
Oh,
We
pleasure's
had,
mine. Thank you.
oh yeah, thanks, man. We had a wonderful time exploring Paranormal Wisconsin, which will be continued many times over because it's such a wonderful hotspot. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, what I'll be talking about today is kind of a working theory of mine. And I want to put a caveat to your audience, which is that this theory is very rough. And, as serendipity would have it, Vincent talked to me about it and inspired me to come on his podcast because I told him about this theory. And then when he asked me about it and said to be on his podcast, I was a little nervous because the theory wasn't as well researched as I would like. Like, I will tell you the required text that I still need to read to kind of finalize the theory, but I'm very glad that even in its infancy that Vincent had me on, because I think this is something that's going to be great for the hive mind of fellow researchers to look into, and fellow esotericists, fellow spiritualists, fellow magicians, because it's something that's really important. And that is the idea that the Holy Grail is not just a mere cup with Christ's blood, that it's my theory that the Holy Grail refers to what is called the Tablet of Destinies in Sumerian legend. And I will get into that throughout the
Just
episode. Oh, yeah, go
just
ahead.
to
Go
interrupt,
ahead.
pretty much he said that much, and the hook was in. I had to hear about this, and so I definitely wanted to have him on the show as soon as possible.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing that because I think it inspired me to expedite this. It's something that I've long lingered about and haven't put in the proper time. I have read some good books on it, but I hopefully this can be kind of a catalyst to help me finish it. So I guess where we will start is with the kind of legend of what the Tablet of Destinies is. And the Tablet of Destinies was a very interesting thing. It was a device of the gods in Sumerian legend. And I'm trying to pull up the link so I can reference it here, but my internet's acting a little slow. Okay, there we go. It's a kind of a device that was very important to the Sumerians, very similar to the Ark of the Covenant in the Old Testament of Christianity, um, similar to the mana machine, other kind of devices that seem to be technological as much as magical. So the Tablet of Destinies was envisaged as a clay tablet inscribed with cuneiform writing, also impressed with cylinder seals, which as a permanent legal document conferred upon the god Enlil his supreme authority as the universe. That's kind of the technical, historic perspective, right? That's what history thinks of it. That's what like academians think of it. Professors who believe that the pyramids were built in the reign of Khufu believe, and the people that believe that the pyramid was built as a tomb would believe.
So,
You'll
so
have
the mainstream academia.
exactly, and you'll have to forgive me when I snarkily say the people who refer to the pyramid as a tomb because that is one of the most ludicrous things I have ever heard.
Oh, I concur. I can think of several better explanations right off the top of my head, and I haven't even dug that deep. But yes, yes, I know what you mean.
Exactly. So
But
so I'll
even
start this.
those, I don't want to talk.
Go
Even
ahead.
those people would admit that the tablets were at some time a physical object.
At the very least, they could admit that, yes,
Okay,
but they
gotcha.
would still say, I think most of them would say that it's a seal that proved Enlil's rule. Although there's lots of very interesting German scholars that are looking at a lot of tablets that came out of Iraq before the Iraq War, and even some that came out afterward, I think. So once those tablets are fully translated, I think we're going to see some really interesting things. So
Yes,
I
yes,
have
indeed.
hopes in the Germans that they will kind of be able to tell us the real truth. Um, so okay. Uh and okay, so here is the Sumerian version. In the Sumerian poem, Ninurta and the turtle, it's the god Enki, rather than Enlil, who holds the tablet, as Enki has stolen it and brought it to the Abzu. And that word, those last two letters, zu, are so important, and I will get into it. Both this poem and the Akkadian Anzu poem also share concern of the theft of the tablet by the bird Imdugud, Sumerian, or Anzu, Akkadian. In the Babylonian Enuma Elish, Tiamat bestows this tablet on Kingu and gives him command of her army. In the end, the tablet always returns to Enlil. So basically, the act of taking the tablet by either Anzu, Imdugud, or Kingu is an act of theft against the gods. And that's also very important. It's a rebellion against the gods, which is also very important. And we will get into that. Give me 1 second here. I'm just going to pull up another source. So, um, okay, give me 1 second. So basically, what happens is the god Zu. I don't want to get bogged down reading the Sumerian versus the Akkadian versus Babylonian because they're all very similar. The etymology, the nomenclature is very similar. So basically, what happens is Zu is a bird god who steals the tablet of destiny from the great god Enlil. Enlil is like the El or the Yahweh of the Sumerian or Akkadian legends. Forgive me. And with the stolen treasure, he escaped to a shelter on a mountain top in Arabia, obviously very similar to Moses at Mount Ararat, or many other stories of going to the top of a mountain meeting God. He knew that the wearer of this tablet had the full control of the universe and the fates of all. The tablet of destiny in Sumerian, this is a very interesting term, Me, was a sort of divine template. And Nu asked two gods to volunteer to slay Zu, but they refused in the face of the supreme power Zu now possessed. So Zu, with this tablet, possessed power over the gods. And he could breathe fire and was so enormous that the flapping of his wings brought on huge storms, the legend says. So, based on kind of just a cursory reading of this, it seems like it controls weather. It can create fire. It puts the gods in a defensive position. Whatever this device is, it's otherworldly powerful. And one could compare it to a nuclear bomb, but that I don't think it's that, because that's very superficial. That couldn't control the weather. It couldn't create fire. This is clearly some kind of device like the Ark of the Covenant, which has in kind of an all-powerful application. They can kind of smite people, to use the old biblical language.
Yes. To go back just a bit, was you said that Enlil was somewhat like Yahweh in
Mm-hmm.
comparatively in the Israelite belief. Was Zu in any way like Lucifer, a rebellious, like lower god?
Well, yes, he was. He was some kind of, I guess you could compare him. Well, it's really interesting. You could compare him to perhaps Gabriel in the Bible, who mounts the rebellion against God. You could also compare him to Lucifer. Um, it's really interesting. I would say Lucifer would probably be a good comparison. And there's similar nomenclature kind of with Lu and Zu.
Okay.
But I here's what I think Zu is. Zu is I and let's get into the etymology of Zu. Uh if you look at it from its base level, it's just Zu with an S, Zeus, right?
Yes, yes.
And now, and let's take it further. If you look at Jesus, what is that but Jesus? And even in Jesus is kind of derived from the Roman and the Greek versions of Jesus, which are very similar. And even in the Hebrew word for Jesus, which is Yeshua, you still have shu, zu in there, Yeshua. And also, and I could go on and on about this, but I'll just leave it at these names. Ichthus in Greek, which is the root of the abbreviation meaning Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. If you combine all the first letters, that's what it means, Ichthus. Ichzus, right? It like the root is there. So
Yes, yes, indeed.
so I think Zeus Zu was actually a good god that was rebelling against an evil group of gods. Like if you read the Sumerian, and I will be frank with your audience, I haven't read the Sumerian legends myself. I have relied on Joseph Farrell's trans or references to translations, and I've also relied, sadly, on Zechariah Sitchin's translations, but only in the base sense, meaning I don't take a lot of his more wilder claims with a lot of I don't give them a lot of grain of salt. But clearly, Zu and Zeus were rebelling against what were, I think, a group of evil gods. And I think of this is just my own personal opinion. I think of Yahweh as Yaldibaoth, or kind of the false god that controlled the earth. I do not think of Yahweh as the true God at all.
That there's a very Gnostic element there. That yes, that basically Yahweh was keeping people under a dictatorial control, and that there was a liberator who was there to try to free people from that.
Exactly. Exactly. And that becomes the question. Like, and I think of Jesus as a liberator. I think he was, even though he's equated with Yahweh, I mean, that's only because you're combining two texts that don't really relate to each other. And there's no mention of Jesus in the New Testament of Yahweh. He only says God, and he talks about the Trinity, which is actually very magical in nature. And so I think that Jesus fits into this paradigm of Zeus and Zu for that very reason as well.
Fascinating. That is very interesting.
It really is. And when you just for the audience, a few really interesting things about Sumerian legends. First of all, anything you read in Hebrew legends or the Kabbalah or anything like that, they I can't say for sure that the Kabbalah came from Sumerian legends, but I can say for sure that the Old Testament came from the Sumerian legends. Just to give the audience a few examples, in Sumerian legends, the Garden of Eden is called the land of Edin, Edin. The Adam is actually referred to as a race called the Adamu. Um, there are, and then they have the Great Flood. The character that is Noah in Sumerian legends is Utnapishtim. And there's just so many similarities that were drawn into the Old Testament that are really Sumerian legends. And another example is the land of Shinar in the Old Testament is Sumeria, Sumer, Shinar. So there's all kinds of name derivations, and again, I could get into many more, but just to give the audience a sense of how important the Sumerians were. I mean, they essentially the creation of what we know of as Western civilization came out of Sumer.
Yes, yes, that's the earliest writing system we know, the
Mm-hmm.
earliest system of government, the, correct me if I'm wrong, the earliest system of math, a lot of things.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And some of, well, and it's almost like the Hebrew Bible, or what we would call the Old Testament in a Christian perspective, is almost like a rewrite of a lot of, well, the Epic of Gilgamesh and the other Sumerian legends, because it was all in that Middle Eastern milieu that, you know, a lot of these peoples were very closely related and had a lot of the same beliefs and folklore and legend and things like that.
Yeah,
Would you say that's correct?
I would. Yes, yes, absolutely. And you could even trace Indian epics like the Vedas and the Upanishads to Sumerian roots as well.
And I don't know if it's highly relevant or not, but I think sometimes people don't always understand. In fact, very few people understand that the Hebrew people, the Israelites, were not always monotheists. That they had a pantheon for quite some time, and that it was basically rearranged and like forced into being just God. But
Exactly, exactly.
the God that before there was God, there were several gods that were kind of jammed together and their identities mixed, but they weren't always monotheists, and that is evident in some parts of the Bible that were still left in
Mm-hmm.
and removed from other parts were removed. But please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I mean, one of the best points to what you're saying is the true translation of let God made man in his image is let us make him in our image. That's how it's originally written in the Hebrew. And then, the ultimate question of in the Old Testament is who is God talking about when when he's telling them, I can't remember if it's Adam or who else, or Cain and Abel, who's telling to stay out of the land of Nod. Who else is in the land of Nod too? Like if he only created Adam and Eve, who's in the land of Nod, and where did those creations come from?
Is that where Cain gets his wife? That
Maybe I'm sorry, I just can't think of it for sure. But
yes, he's told he's driven away from. Cain murders Abel, and as his punishment, he's driven away from all the people that God created. But he
yes,
somehow finds a wife and has kids and stuff. Some other people. It's like, well, who are these
yes.
people? It there's some very difficult to answer paradoxes come up repeatedly in the Bible.
Exactly, exactly. Because it's a book, just like you said, it's taken from Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian legends, and packaged as some kind of moral guidepost, which it is absolutely not. It's full of ritual sacrifice, full of pagan elements. But the main point being is I think the story of Zu was corrupted, that he was some kind of devilish character, or, I think it was a he, at least according to history. And I think he was actually quite the opposite. I think he was a hero that was rebelling against the gods. And he stole the Tablet of Destinies because that was giving them otherworldly control over the earth. And that leads me to my next point of, just what is the Tablet of Destinies? So Joseph P. Farrell has a really good book about this called The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics and Ancient Texts. And he talks a lot about this. And he thinks that the tablet was some kind of ancient tech device that was able to connect somehow to a group of satellites in our solar system, and possibly what we even think of as quasars, which could be, according to physicist Paul LaViolette, ultra high-tech plasma electricity generating devices to be used by the tablet in warfare, to create kind of I guess what you'd call plasma strikes. And we can get into that later in the episode as well.
Yes,
I
yes.
think the tablet was much more than that, though. I think it could also create psychological warfare through microwave weaponry. I think it could be used to generate alchemy, turn certain metals into other metals. I think it was a very important ruling device for these quote unquote gods who were here and who kind of created the Sumerians. I kind of try to stay away from ancient alien territory, but the fact of the matter is that, and we can get into this later in the episode, the gods of the Sumerian age were not real gods; they were imposters. And I include Yahweh in that. I include El and Enlil in that. They were absolute imposters. They were not God. There is a one true God. I believe that, but I believe it's in the form of consciousness. It's not a man. It's not a woman. It's outside of our matrix. So just to
Anything,
continue. Oh, go
not to
ahead.
interrupt, but to me, I have a similar belief that any being able to create a universe so vast, so huge, and so old would not be a being that we could relate to one on one. You
No,
know, it'd be
no,
like me trying to have a deep conversation with a fruit fly. It's just not gonna
exactly.
it's not gonna work. So yes, the over personalized God, I just do not accept that. That doesn't mean that I don't believe there's a God in some form. Yeah.
Yes, and what I would argue is that God communicates through synchronicity and kind of synchronous events. Um, and yeah, I think that's how God communicates with people, not through like, and that could include dreams, but I don't think that I'll say this, I highly question visions and stigmatas and stuff like that. I'll leave it at that. But
Yes. And I would say that there are maybe many other entities who are all too happy to step in and play God.
mhm.
And that if any sort of being had this kind of ultra high tech control panel, basically, they could simulate miracles and,
Oh, of course.
you know,
Of course.
curses and things and play God with human beings.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, imagine if you had a Samsung tablet and you went back to the Dark Ages. People would think you were God. You would not need to ever carry a sword, and you could probably rule all of Europe.
Yes, yes. I mean, people would be in awe of your power.
Exactly, and that's without actually demonstrating death or anything. I mean, this device was a deadly device. I think it was some kind of very serious device that controlled plasma weapons. And so, just to continue on that, I'll try to make this brief. But Joseph Farrell theorizes that what we know as the trident of Neptune was actually a plasma signature that was left in the sky after a plasma strike on the Earth, and that's it takes the form of a trident. He goes into the physics of it, which is beyond my comprehension, but it's in that book. And he that's why he was saying that it appears in a lot of petroglyphs as well, because it was a marker of what people saw in the sky during this battle. Um,
Kind of like a mushroom cloud if you drop it on someone.
exactly. If you saw a mushroom cloud, you would see applications of that on rock petroglyphs as well and in legends.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a great point. So Joseph Farrell thinks that the planet Marduk, which is mentioned in, I can't remember, I think it's Babylonian um legend, was reduced to rubble because of this device and became what we now know of as the asteroid belt between Mars and Mars. Is it
Oh yes, yes.
Mars
And
and,
Saturn, isn't it?
Saturn, yes. Yeah, I encourage anyone to read this book. It's called The Cosmic War, Interplanetary Warfare, Modern Physics, and Ancient Texts by Joseph P. Farrell. He goes into very good detail about this. Um, and so let's get into Legend of Zeus and its parallels to Zoo. So Zeus was born to Kronos, Father Time. Soon after the creation of the world, the then ruler of the gods, Kronos, who is Saturn, who had learned that one of his children would overthrow him, swallowed Zeus's three sisters and two brothers at birth, Demeter, Hera, Hestia, Hades, and Poseidon. Zeus would have been eaten himself if Rhea hadn't slipped Kronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes in his place, hiding her youngest child in a cave on the Cretan mound Ida. There, Zeus was raised by nymphs and met his first wife Metis, or Wisdom. On her advice, he masked himself as the Olympian cup bearer, which is very important, and tricked his father into drinking poisoned wine. And the word cup bearer is very important. We'll get into that. The wine made Kronos vomit so much that he ultimately disgorged Zeus's siblings, intact and ready for revenge. This, their second birth, made the youngest among them Zeus, actually their eldest brother. Thus, they had no problem in acknowledging his authority, led by him and helped by the one-eyed Cyclops, which is probably some kind of light device, and the hundred-handed Hecatochieres. Zeus, the hundred-handed, meaning probably 100 different plasma beams, light beams, some kind of weapon. Zeus freed all of them from Kronos' imprisonment. The siblings overthrew Kronos and the Titans during a decade-long war called the Titanomachy, or Titanomachy. I don't know what the pronunciation is, the official one. But, okay, so we have a similar story. We don't have the Tablet of Destinies mentioned, but we have a character named Zeus who has a one-eyed Cyclops, which is probably some kind of laser device, and the hundred-handed, which is probably some kind of device to submit 100 different plasma rays or some other kind of weapon. Hecatochieres. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Hecatoncheires. So they're not referencing the Tablet of Destinies directly, but they're clearly making reference to it there. And also the cup bearer. Let's get into that. So Zeus masked himself as an Olympian cup bearer. Why is that important? Because the Holy Grail is forever known in modern history and in the annals of history, the historical record, as a cup. Now, what I would argue is that's the closest thing they had to compare it to, and it's not a cup at all. What I would argue is that the Tablet of Destinies is shaped concave like a satellite, which is why it was compared to a cup. So the Holy Grail comes from the word Graal, which means cup in France. It was known throughout the Middle Ages as a bowl-shaped vessel, not a cup. So it was termed a cup in nomenclature but they didn't really have a term for satellite. You couldn't really call it a bowl. You couldn't call it a plate. The closest thing they had was cup.
Well, and think, I mean, if you were at a high level of technology and that was all taken away, how would you
Mm-hmm.
describe stuff that used to exist?
Exactly,
You'd have to
exactly.
use things that you had around you. And I was thinking, as you were saying, we still call a satellite dish a
Mm-hmm.
satellite dish,
We
you
do,
know, to
absolutely,
this day. So
and
that
we're
makes
gonna get
a lot of
into
sense.
a really important point about that, which is that the nomenclature we use today, even in the form of satellite dish, is related to this. So, um, okay, so known throughout the Middle Ages as a bowl-shaped vessel, not a cup. This is especially interesting when thinking about Joseph Farrell's theory of this being a device that could access satellites. A concave bowl-shaped satellite with no bearing to any cup would undoubtedly be described as a bowl-shaped vessel. And I'm sorry, guys, I'm just reading from my notes, ladies and gentlemen. I'm reading from my notes to make sure I get this right. So it's going to sound a little rote, if you will.
You're fine, man. I
um,
was just thinking, and just riffing a second, we still use ancient terms to describe very modern weapons. Right now, we're sending those javelin missiles to Ukraine.
yes, yes.
Well, they're not literally javelins, but we do make those comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
Those metaphors, those names stick around through history.
Yep, yep, exactly, exactly. Um, So attempts have been made to show the derivation of the word itself, graal from garalhe, which is I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but that's an Arabic term for foreskin, in allusion
Huh.
to, uh, might be Israeli. I'm just looking at the actual word here. Let me copy it to make sure. But it's a word for foreskin, in allusion to the bloodshed and the circumcision, the type of the blood of Christ. But it appears certain that it means vessel, cup, and this is very important, or shell. Which to me, a shell is very representative of a satellite. The poetry of the Middle Ages makes numerous mentions. This is really important. This is going to speak to your point about the satellite dish. The poetry of the Middle Ages makes numerous mention of the Sant, Saint Graal, Saint Graal, in French, San, S-A-N, are you ready for this? G-N-I-A-L, Sanjal, Sanjal. What does that represent? Well, it's pretty eerily similar to signal, isn't it? As
Yes,
in
indeed.
satellite signal.
Wow.
So you have in the root of the nomenclature of the Grail references to a satellite, some kind of device that can access a satellite. You have signal. I mean, it's spelled S-A-N space G-N-I-A-L. Sanyal. I mean, it's eerily similar to signal.
Yes, yes, indeed. Wow.
So, yeah, you have all of it. And again, I want to apologize to the audience. This is an area that I want to explore much more. I want to get into old runic languages. I want to get into Gaelic and Welsh language as well. I have not had the chance to research that. I'm sure there is more to be found there. According to legend, the vessel was brought to Earth by angels, so similar to the Sumerian legend and very similar to Zeus's legend, even though you don't see the Cyclops being brought to Earth or the 100-armed monster being brought to Earth. And kept first by them, then by a company of knights, commanded by a king in a temple built expressly for it at the summit of the unapproachable mountain, Mont Salvage. Now, this is from Parsifal. So this is clearly representing Mount Olympus, Mount Salvage, Mount Olympus. I haven't got into the nomenclature roots of that yet, but I've got to believe there's something. So in 1170, it became confounded with the legends of Arthur and the Round Table by Creatin de Troyes. and other troubadours of northern France. In the legend of the Round Table, the Sant, S-A-I-N-T, Graal, Graal, is considered as the vessel used by Christ at the Last Supper, in which Joseph of Arimathea caught the blood that fell from the side of Christ. Hence the erroneously attached meaning to the word as sangreal, S-A-N-G-R-E-A-L, i.e. royal blood, blood of the Lord. Now, what I would argue is this, that the meaning of sangreal isn't necessarily false, royal blood. I think that sangreal comes from Sant Graal, meaning that to access this device, it's a DNA-based device. You have to have some kind of royal blood to access it. And that's why you see the similar nomenclature there. You have in the form of the cup itself, you have Saint, S-A-I-N-T-G-R-A-L, and then you have in the form of the blood of Christ, S-A-N-G space R-E-A-L. And I don't think that's by coincidence at all. I think
Yes.
it's because, oh, sorry, go ahead, man. Go ahead.
I'm just so you're saying that there would be a bloodline aspect to this?
I would. And I would say that it makes logical sense. The gods of old, with all their technology, would never allow a device that can be accessed by the humans who are their slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at, like, we even have that technology today with fingerprint guns. I mean, the NRA has done a pretty good job of like not allowing that in America, but they exist. And if
Yes.
we have mere fingerprint guns now, imagine the technology that a spacefaring civilization, or at the very least a solar system faring civilization, if they came from Mars or somewhere else, would certainly have some kind of genetic lock on this technology.
Yes, that makes a ton of sense. I was just thinking of the theory that I can't source it precisely, but it goes around that the Holy Grail was a symbol for the bloodline of Christ and his descendants, that he had descendants.
Yes, exactly. And that story, I don't think was that erroneous. I mean, the author of this site thought it was, but I don't think it is. I think it's talking about some kind of bloodline that can access this device.
The two ideas really fit kind of hand in glove, that the Grail would be a technological device, but that it would only be accessible to people of a certain bloodline.
Exactly.
Those two connect really well.
Exactly. And if you look, I'm trying not to get too conspiratorial here, and I'm trying not to extrapolate, but there is
this is a place for it. Go ahead.
I love it, man. I love it. And that's what's important for us researchers, to be able to express opinions that may seem far out without derision and castigation and fear of being mocked like you would be by mainstream lemmings. So I appreciate you offering this forum.
Oh, hey, that's what we're here for. Theory, but based in part on theory and conjecture, as the late Leonard Nimoy would say.
Absolutely, my friend. So on that note of this holy bloodline, I find it so interesting that there's this massive DNA collection going on right now with COVID. And Peter Thiel and Palantir are literally cataloging DNA across the entire world, with the exception of China. I think China has their own DNA farming operation. And, if you look at the Mormon religion, that is very obsessed with that, which is one of the foremost modern religions, there seems to be some kind of massive effort to I don't think it's just about cataloging DNA. I think it's about finding DNA. I think it's about finding somebody who has true quote unquote blue blood DNA, but not blue blood in the sense that they're related to a Windsor, a Habsburg, or uh, von Thun, or an Axis, that German family or whatever it is. I can never pronounce it right. But I think it's
Yeah, I know what you
more.
mean. Yes.
I think it's more about finding Sumerian blood and finding people who might have like old Sumerian DNA in them. I think that might be what it's about.
Wow.
And again, forgive me, I'm kind of waxing conspiratorial there, but
No, no, that's
there's
fine.
clearly an effort in this DNA hunt to find something. And what that something is, we don't yet know. But I find it interesting in relation to what we're talking about now.
Yes, and the whole there's there's folklore and theorizing that there are people whose DNA is connected to their experiences, that
Mm-hmm.
those who have repeated alien abduction experiences, it seems to run in families,
Exactly.
and that the people who interact with the Fae or have second sight, it tends to be a hereditary trait. And some people in positions of power may be very interested in finding people like that.
Exactly. And again, you wonder if those traits come from these Sumerian gods who openly stated in their texts that they breed with human women.
Yes, indeed. That
So
is a fascinating idea. Yes.
it's a very interesting point. Um, and so let's get into we talked about the Tablet of Destinies, we talked about the Grail. So the information I listed above were kind of highlights from the book Parsifal, which gives a history of the Grail. It also, Graham Hancock is convinced it shows the location of the Ark of the Covenant, um, which is another device that is very powerful, that has a lot of traits that the Tablet of Destinies does. So the question I ask is just, what did the Knights Templar find when they were in the Temple of Solomon? So they were, they essentially, the Templars approached the French knight Hugh de Payens approached in 1119 King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, and Warmond, the patriarch of Jerusalem, proposed creating a Catholic monastic religious order, I guess similar to the Jesuits or something like that, or the Franciscans. And King Baldwin and Warmond agreed to the request. And the king named the Templars' headquarters, the right wing in the royal palace, on the Temple Mount in the newly captured Al Aqsa Mosque. So the Temple Mount had a mystique because it was above what was believed to be the ruins of the Temple of Solomon. So the Crusaders therefore refer to the Al Aqsa Mosque as Solomon's Temple, and from this location, the new order took the name the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, or Templar Knights. So that's where the Templar comes from, the Temple of Solomon. The order, with about 9 knights, including Godfrey de Saint Omer and Andre de Montbard, had few financial resources and relied on donations to survive. Their emblem was of 2 knights riding on a single horse. So the impoverished status of the Templars, as we all know, did not last very long. They had a powerful advocate in Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and in 1129, the Council of Troyes, he led a group leading churchmen to officially approve and endorse the order on behalf of the church. So this form of blessing, the Templars became a favored charity throughout Christendom. And this is very important, receiving money, land, businesses, and noble-born sons from family who were eager to help with the fight in the Holy Land. So because it got the official blessing of Bernard of Clairvaux, who's a major figure in the Catholic Church, money just started pouring into the Templars. I mean, they were flush with cash. And at the Council of Peace in 1135, Pope Innocent II initiated the first papal monetary donations to the order. So, I would argue that between 11, maybe 1129 and 11, I don't know, 75, they dug out the Solomon's Temple, and that's when they found something. They found something very, very powerful, to the point where King Philip of France in the 1300s or the late 1200s had to ask them for money. And not only that, the Pope, I believe, had to ask them for money. I need to fact check that.
Well,
But
were they not very influential in creating modern banking?
they
They
were, they
they
were,
were so wealthy.
they
Yeah.
created, the story is that they created banking because people going to Jerusalem would give them money at the gate, at the southern France or whatever is the access to the Mediterranean where they took the ships. They would get credit slips, and then they would in turn turn those credit slips in on the road to Jerusalem. Now, I think that is a fable. I think what happened is that the Templars, along with finding some kind of powerful device that I believe may have been the Tablet of Destinies, and I think it was, they also found a ton of gold, and they used the money that they were given by the church to buy gold if they were given notes, and they amassed a ton of gold, which allowed them to create these deposit slips, so these kind of credit slips. I do not believe in the official story, which is that they merely took notes from Europe, deposited them in a bank or gold at wherever the entry point was to the road to Jerusalem, and then when they got to Jerusalem or close to it, they would receive their money back in gold or whatever it was. I think it was much more than that, and I think, yes, you're right. They did create modern banking. And what's interesting about that is Joseph P. Farrell also argues that there's a physics and a mysticism and a kind of matrix magic involved in banking. And I would argue that maybe the device, maybe they were able to use a device at its base level in the alchemical sense of either creating gold or, and I know this sounds far-fetched, but I do think there's some kind of mysticism involved with banking that we don't know about, to use a device for money. And the example that I would give of that is the Rothschild, the Red Shield of the Rothschild dynasty. Tracy Twyman's research, she had theorized that the Rothschilds ascended so prominently and so quickly through banking because of a device they had, which the Rothschild or the Red Shield, the 6-pointed star, the red 6-pointed star of their family seal represented. So we do have a corollary in history for kind of a device being able to help kind of catalyze banking or generate money out of thin air. So yeah, but yeah, the fact of the matter is, I think you and I can both agree that the general story of the notes passing and the credit slips are a complete horseshit, right?
Well, if they found the Temple of Solomon, they'd find a ton of gold, and
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
they could serve as the Fort Knox of medieval times, and that makes a lot more sense than taking in relatively small amounts of pilgrims' money. Yeah, I would find that very easy to believe.
So yeah, at a base level, we can agree they did find a bunch of gold, which I do believe. I will remain firm my belief that the device had alchemical
Oh, I don't doubt that. You make a
applications and
very
possibly
interesting
applications
idea.
for banking as well. As far as, and what I think that device does, and I think the Rothschild device might do, is almost create a magnetic network from banks to where people flock to banks with their money. I think that's the simplest explanation for how that device works, and also maybe puts a spell on them for in trusting their money to a bank, which, as we all know, fractional reserve lending is completely fictitious. There's no way that fractional reserve lending, meaning having a fraction of the deposits on hand that you lend, let's say you're a bank, you have 1/80th of the money that you are lending. That's how our modern banking system works. That would not exist without a belief system in place.
Oh, yes, it's a cultural construct. It only
Mm-hmm.
works if everybody
It's
believes in it.
completely matrix.
If everybody suddenly stopped believing in it, the system would fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I was when you first mentioned a like mystical system for creating banking. I mean, that's pretty mind blowing. But it made me think of John Maynard Keynes, the you know economist
Oh,
from
Keynes. Yeah,
yeah
yeah.
Keynes. I'm
Yep.
mispronouncing. Yes,
No problem. No
um,
problem.
he was a hugely influential economist in the 20th century. And he basically said that, in his words, the markets run on animal spirits, that there is not a
Oh,
rational,
interesting.
yes, that there's not a rational people buy this stock because it fits this criteria, it meets these benchmarks, this company has these qualities. No, it's much more subjective. It's much more, frankly, mystical, that you can't explain in purely rational terms why one stock goes up and another goes down, why
Mm-hmm.
one company profits and another goes bankrupt. That there
Mm-hmm.
is not a materialist explanation for that. And he described it as being like animal spirits.
Well, yeah. I mean, I would mention the phrase that many investors know, which is that millionaires study the stock market, billionaires study astrology.
That well said. Yes, that is a thing that goes on, and there has been more than one spiritualist medium who has made fortunes advising the very wealthy.
Mm-hmm.
That they won't talk about it publicly, but a lot of the very, very wealthy do things in private that they don't discuss in public in
Yeah, yeah,
in the mystical world, in the mystical arts.
yeah. Well, yeah. So I think that there is something mystical to the Templars' finances as well, and this device probably helped them out with that. But there's a question looming, right? So if the Templars just had money, why didn't the Catholic Church kill them off right away and take their money? Why didn't France kill them off? And what I would argue is that I think that France and other papal powers knew that the Templars had this device and that they had to approach them very carefully. They couldn't just wage open war against them. And it took them almost 200 years to crush the Templars. So at dawn on Friday, 13 October 1307, this is a date where many people say that the date Friday the 13th comes from. King Philip ordered Jacques de Molay and scores of other French Templars to be arrested. The arrest warrant started with the words, God is not pleased. I won't read the French version because I'll butcher it. God is not pleased. We have enemies of the faith in the kingdom. Um, Conventional history will tell you that the Knights Templar was disbanded and killed off by 1320, maybe 1340, maybe some historians will tell you 1360, 1380. But we can see scores of Templar influence beyond these years. And
Oh yes, absolutely.
what I think happened is the Templars kind of disappeared uh, into the shadows and operated almost like a super state, much like the Vatican today operates like, much like criminal organizations operate like the cartel. Not that the Templars are involved in criminal activity, but I think they continued their empire and they continued to kind of hide their gold.
Well, at that time, opposing the Pope was criminal activity. So,
Exactly. Yeah. So I
yes.
guess they were criminals.
Do you give any credence to the idea that the Templars, or the Templar underground, you might say, became the Freemasons?
Yeah, I do give some credence to that. Um, I do give some credence to that. I would say that here's what I believe about the Masons. It's essentially a what's the word? A job fair for people in the New World Order or the elite. It's also a job fair for adepts. So there's kind of two competing forces in the Mason, like high adepts, like studiers of Paracelsus and Eliphas Levi that know true magic. And then the other side is just the New World Order, who looks for psychopaths and sociopaths within the Masonic ranks and brings them into powerful positions in government, the military, and finance. So it's a recruiting ground. That's what I'm looking for. It's a recruiting ground. But if you think about it from the Templar sense, it would have been a great way to find new Templars or those loyal to the Templar Knights. And it started in Scotland, which was a huge Templar territory at the time. So yes, I give credence to that theory. Absolutely. I just don't know how far they were involved past
Oh,
like the
oh yes.
1700s.
Um, and I would add, just to your description of the Freemasons, you also have to add the third key component. It's an old man's supper club,
Yes, yes.
where most of the people in at a lower level have no idea of anything going on.
Oh
You
yes, and
know,
that's that. And just to add to your point, that's why I'm saying it's a recruiting ground because the guys that are the 33rd degree Masons will know who's going to do their bidding and who's not.
I yes, I can fully get where you're coming from with that. Um, oh, I had one question for you about the Templars.
Sure.
Um, there were allegations at in medieval times that they had found something, but that thing they had found was some image of Baphomet, and that
Yes.
would you go on about that?
Yes, that's a very good point. So I think Baphomet is a god that does not exist. And if you look at the root word Baphomet and you take away, it's only two letters different from the way Mohammed was spelled at the time, which was Mahomet, Mahomet. So, what better way to rile up the public against them than to create a false god that they were worshiping called Baphomet, which the root word itself would stir up the most tempest of fires among the public, the Christian public, because of its mere word relation to Mahomet. And
That
I
I can
wonder
see that.
if in some cases it was pronounced Maphomet, back in the Old English, we just don't know. So that would be my answer to that question. And I can get into the other allegations as well if you'd like.
Oh, well, just that they had some kind of device that told them things, that some sort of a talking head or something. And I'm just wondering if that might be similar to the Grail slash Tablet of Destinies,
So
something that's giving them information.
that's very interesting. And the way the church describes it's first of all, the way the Catholic Church describes the charges against the Templar is something out of a comic book, as if someone was writing a graphic novel based in the Templar days. They spat on the cross. You must engage in homosexual acts to be a Templar. They only did their rites at midnight, like just like almost comical accusations. And but what was interesting is you bring up the most important one. They talked to a head on a pike. That they got some kind of spiritual messages from a talking head. It makes you wonder if that part was based on maybe there was a hologram on this device that they were trying to get information from and trying to crack the code on.
And if you describe FaceTiming on your smartphone, it doesn't come off. If you try to explain it in medieval times, it doesn't come off that different, really.
It doesn't. No, it would absolutely. The way you're describing it with the head is the only way you can describe it.
And what do we call the experts who come on TV? Talking heads.
Talking heads, exactly. See, you actually are coming up with. I didn't even know. I didn't even think about the dish thing, or the talking head. But through both of our conversation here, we're coming up with some truly amazing things, and I do think that's where it comes from.
Cool.
Because all a screen is, like all FaceTime is a talking head. All a hologram would be is a talking head. And it's just and that's the Catholic Church way of defaming them. They were talking to a headless man on a pike, or a man's head on a pike.
Mm-hmm.
It's
And
just
those are just sensationalist allegations but they're weirdly specific.
exactly why that specific. Why a talking head? Clearly, the French knew something of what they were really doing, and accusing them of worshiping the god Baphomet, when you have Muhammad, and then you're actually you're talking about them talking to a head on a pike, when they're probably using it to talk to a hologram on this device. It starts to make sense. And
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Especially, I had never heard the name thing, but once you said it, it's like, yeah, that would totally ring true.
yeah, do you post any links on your site? I can send you
Yes, by all means.
yeah, I'll send it to you so you can post that. But it was Mahomet, and I wonder if it was pronounced Maphomet, like Baphomet.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, so basically these were absurd trumped up charges. Philip was in numerous debt. He actually tried to ask the Jews in France to give him money, and when they didn't, he expelled them and killed I think half of them.
Oh man.
So this guy was like up to his eyeballs in debt. He was a complete joke. And you know what bothers me? I want to say something that really bothers me about the paranormal community and the research community
Go ahead.
is the people who believe in the lies about the Templars, that they were worshiping Baphomet, they were engaging in homosexual acts, they were talking to a head on a pike, when it was the Catholic freaking Church who was making those accusations. And Tracy Twyman has said that there's a certain Latin book that was recently translated that exposes that. But what that book was probably written by somebody in the papacy,
Hmm.
and there is no evidence other than the word of the Pope that the Templars were this evil. And
Oh
I don't take the word of the Pope or the word of the papacy or the Catholic Church with anything but a grain of salt.
yes. And we're not talking Pope Francis. We're talking this was the medieval popes who had people
Yes,
killed like it was no problem.
exactly. There were things called warring popes back then, if you can believe that term.
Oh yes.
It's just common.
Unfortunately, yes, that totally happened. And with the Medicis and that whole era, which isn't the same era, but there was no limit to the corruption that happened
Exactly.
at the Vatican.
It tells the same story, doesn't it? Noble
Yes.
elites are working with the Catholic Church. Sometimes in the Medici family's case, they became the popes themselves. So let's get back to what happened to the Templars. Where did they go? Well, first of all, I think they traveled throughout the world, and there's that tribe in Nova Scotia who I can't remember the name. I can Google it next time you chime in. I'll Google it and I'll try to pull it up. But they had marked stones of the Templar cross. Of course, that's where the that reality show, the History Channel show, takes place. I think it's a Templar treasure.
Oh, yes.
Curse of Oak Island, which
Yes, that's the one. Yes.
I'm sorry to mention that on your podcast because it's a terrible show, but
it's an interesting root concept. It's just done as
it is. I just wish
reality
I'd find
TV.
something, man.
Yes,
Like
yes.
6 seasons. Find something.
Yes, it's not. I don't watch it because of that very reason. It doesn't hold my interest very well. But no. But the thing there, the actual site is fascinating, and there are remnants of things that have been connected to the Templars in many places in North America, and that there's a whole lot of ongoing research of were they in the Americas? Were they in a lot of places pre-Columbus? And I don't think that that's ludicrous at all. I think that that's very realistic.
Yeah, no, and so you have that aspect, and I'll get into that at the end of the point I'll make as far as how they leverage their power using that. But the act of piracy, which is derived from privateers or private captains that were hired to rob ships, I think that most of your viewers are educated enough to realize that pirates were not organic. They were hired by rival empires. The British would hire pirates to sack the Spanish. The French would hire pirates to sack the Brits.
Oh, yes, they're much more like mercenaries or what we today call private contractors.
Exactly. The only organic pirate in my mind is Blackbeard because he was born and raised by pirates in the Bahamas. And he didn't really know the fact. I mean, he did when he kind of grew up, but he was a bit more rogue, and he would attack British ships at will. And in that era, but that was in like the early early 1700s, mid 1700s, when piracy was in its height. But in its infancy, the Templars acted as pirates, probably to try to get back some of their wealth and to control the sea trade. And the interesting question that you have to ask is, yes, the Crusades probably set back the British Empire and the French, and the Brits were just coming up then. That was early Britannia, but still there was a power base in Rome and France as early as like the 1300s. Why did it take them until 1492 to quote unquote discover America? And I would argue that the Templars controlled the seas, and they were stopping fleets from going over to the Americas. And I wonder if they made a deal with them. Now, again, this is an aspect that I have to research a lot, in my kind of research in the Templars. But the logical progressions don't make any sense as far as the focus on the Crusades. And then all of a sudden it takes another 150 years to find America. Like they wouldn't have sought like alternate mining locations on the sea and alternate trade routes with other cultures. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Yes, I see where you're coming from, and that they may have been in the Americas already and holding back other people from other European powers from colonizing it because they're already there first.
Exactly. And you have the Welsh king Madoc, who
If
came
you hadn't
over.
brought him up, I was definitely going to bring him up next. Go ahead.
Yes, and I believe, let's check that out together right now. Let me Google that. Um uh he came over, I think, in the 1300s. And you know, clearly when the Americans when Andrew Jackson started Manifest Destiny, what was that, around the 1835?
That thereabouts. That sounds right.
Yeah,
Yes.
I here's what I think Manifest Destiny was. I think it was to cover up the fact that there were Native American tribes that were Islamic and that were clearly Islamic and
Wow.
may have even had trade routes to the Islamic world. And the same goes for Welsh tribes, Welsh settlements, and other tribes. And of course, just to obliterate them because they wanted to enslave them. There's obviously that, and they wanted them off the land. But there's so much more to that ethnic cleansing that went on than merely just uprooting Native American tribes. I think
Wow.
America was very fearful of someone going to London or to France or to the papacy and making a formal claim that they had a territory there before the 1700s, before America was established. And that's what caused Manifest Destiny. That's a personal
Wow.
opinion of mine.
That is a take that I have not heard before, especially the presence of Muslims in America early on.
Yes.
Um,
Well,
that's
there's,
fascinating.
yes. If you look at the character King Philip, who was, what tribe was he under? Let me look at it. King Philip. If you look at the way he's dressed, he does not look like a Native American at all. And he looks like he was like out of the Moorish Spain. It's really weird. And they called him King Philip, and people thought it was like a mocking thing. But I don't think it was. I think they thought of him as regal in his area, and they knew he wore clothes that were not traditional. Let me get a.
Well, and both pop culture and even some fairly more advanced education does tend to lump all Native Americans together. And
Yes,
that's
yes.
not how they see themselves. And they always have seen themselves as separate nations
Mm-hmm.
and pursuing vastly different lifestyles. There were, hunter gatherers, but there were also people building pyramids. You
Mm-hmm.
know, there were, it's kind of like the way in America, Asian covers everything from India to Japan, even though
Exactly.
that makes no sense at all.
It's the most ludicrous thing ever, and
Yes,
these academians who dare call us in politically unpolitically correct are the ones saying that. It's just ridiculous.
yes.
So, okay, he was part of the Wampanoag tribe, but King Madoc came over to America allegedly in 1170.
Wow.
And this was in Welsh folklore tales. And then you have, of course, Vinland in the Norse tales, which is a land where they developed wine, which I think was either California or Florida. Hopefully not Florida, because that would be really shitty wine. Um, but I think the Templars would have profited from that. I think they spread out, and I think that's the explanation of why it took the colonists so long to come over. I also think that the Templars just hid out in Europe. They had many allies. They had to relinquish their castle and they may have had to relinquish their land, but they had allies who would, keep their money because they believed in the Templar cause. Um, the other, the other thing about the Templars, and this is going to get really conspiratorial, but I appreciate you for having this forum,
Hey, no
is
problem.
that when you look at the airship mystery of 1898, when you hear all these stories in the 1800s and 1700s, like Dawn of the Magicians, of all this technology that existed, that was way ahead of its time. You start to wonder if when the Templars went over to the New World, if they created colonies, in deep South America, and even in America, that they would eventually have had to left them, which they would have had until probably the 1840s, if not the 1880s, to have. And they just started developing their own technology, possibly trying using this device. I still have not found an explanation of the 1898 airships that make any sense. I do believe in them 100%.
Oh, I'm sure that people saw
Um,
them. What they are, I have no
clearly,
idea. Yes.
exactly what they are, they have no idea, but clearly there was some group that was developing technology that was way ahead of its time. And we don't know what happened to Templars, and you and I are smart enough, and your audience is smart enough to realize that they didn't just go away. So while we don't know where they went, we can assume that they continued to prosper because they, in my mind, likely had this device. I don't think this device would be something that once you had it could be captured. I think you would find ways to keep hiding it, especially with the network the Templar had and the money they had. They would have thought of that first. They would have never left it open for King Philip to take. And it's funny I say King Philip, right? For the actual King of France. We're just talking about King Philip of the Wampanoag tribe. But
Yes. And I just when you're talking about pre-Columbian Muslims in America, I'm thinking I just was listening to well, actually I was listening to Rick Lewis's podcast, and he was talking about the Moors and
yes.
tangentially, and the Islamic world was very advanced in the medieval times, while Europe was in the Dark Ages. The Muslim world was, developing algebra and, geometry and was highly advanced for that time. And
Mm-hmm.
if there were Muslims in America, that they could have gone on to pursue higher technology. And that makes sense as far as a breakaway civilization, which is not a concept that I created, obviously. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
people have talked about that, especially Walter Bosley. But that is one source of a possible breakaway civilization.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, it definitely is. And there could be 4 or 5 breakaway civilizations on Earth
Oh,
right now.
yes. That's the thing. Sometimes when you get into the topic of pre-Columbian non-native peoples in the Americas, it's always assumed that there's that it's there's racism involved. But
Mm.
no, there could be a lot of different people who visited the Americas. And I do tend to believe in hyperdiffusionism, that there was a lot more contact between different parts of the so-called old world, like China, like Japan, um, and also Europeans, especially the Welsh, and others and Africans that were in the Americas well, way before Columbus,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
that could have been multiple civilizations.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, the idea that Columbus discovered America, which is still propagated by the majority of the faculty in academia, with the caveat that it was founded by Native Americans via the land bridge, which is another ludicrous theory that I won't waste our time with.
There's
But
genetics that disprove that
of
completely, and there's so many things.
course,
Yes.
yeah, and so operating on just that alone and the wealth the Templars had, they could have set up a virtual network in America. And when they smelled the British Empire at the doorstep, they could have shut it down within 70 years, or maybe less, 30 years, and gone somewhere else, maybe South America.
Where we
Um,
know there are lost cities because we're finding them like currently as they're tearing down the Amazon rainforest. They're finding cities under there.
exactly, exactly. So there's just so much we don't know. Um, I think based on your timeline that you told me, we got to wrap this up a little bit here.
Yeah,
And
I hate to, but unfortunately, we've only got about another 10 minutes.
yeah, no,
Um,
no problem, no problem. So I would just end by asking this: why was the Grail so heavily mentioned in France? And the researcher Howie McCoskey, who's a wonderful researcher, he believes that Paris was Jerusalem and that Jesus existed in Paris. Now, I have not had the time to research that, but it begs the question when you
that's
think
quite a
of
claim. But go ahead, please.
begs the question it begs the question of why there were so many Templars from France. I mean, if you looked at like a percentage diagram of where the Templars came from, it's probably 70-80% French. And now, granted, France at the time was a huge papal state. It didn't belong to the papacy, but they were very aligned with the Catholic Church. You could argue that. But again, it makes you wonder, and why was Parsival based not in Jerusalem, but in Europe with characters going from France and other areas into Northern Africa and the Middle East? It just, and the name, you know, uh, oh, I won't get into that now because that would be down a rabbit hole. But it makes you wonder. I would leave the audience just ask the question: was Jerusalem the Christian Holy Land? And I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of evidence to this. Howie McCoskey talks a lot about it. I would encourage you to kind of look at his research, but I just and here's another thing I would offer. You have Graal, Grail, right? And you have the Gauls in France. Who were the Gauls? And you have Gaelic culture, Irish mysticism, Scottish mysticism, Gaelic. That word Grail kind of comes all over Europe, or Graal, and it makes you wonder. It makes you wonder. And then you have the bloodline of Jesus that many researchers trace to France. So, or to Paris. I believe it's Paris specifically, but France. So I would leave the audience with that thought. And then, we'll wrap it up. Do you have any other questions or
Oh, I have about 100, but I'm gonna have to have you back so we can elaborate more on what you found and what you think about various things. And I mean, we've only scratched the surface on this. Um, the Going back to the god who steals the tablet, um,
Mhm.
Anzu. Um, he seems like a Promethean character, like he's stealing fire from the gods and giving it to man.
Yes, he very much does. Um, which is interesting because Prometheus was the one who was punished by Zeus. Um, I don't know the answer to that other than to say that I don't think there's any corollary from the story of Prometheus to any of the old tales other than who was it that pushed had to push the boulder up the mountain, but that was, I
Oh,
think, a road.
Sisyphus.
Yes. So I don't know the answer to that
Oh
question. I
no,
wish I
would just suggest that all of these stories are retold memories, retold and retold and retold over millennia. That you're going to
Mhm.
get characters are going to change. Um, you know, kind of the nature of folklore. It's going to evolve, but that really it seems like in one story Zeus is the liberator. In another
Mhm.
one, somebody else, Prometheus, is liberating fire and tech, which is technology, from Zeus.
Mhm.
But that could be another incarnation of the same story, essentially.
It very well could be. It very well could be. And what's really interesting is that there's mentions made to time loops in those stories. Like Prometheus wakes up every day and has his innards eaten out by a bird.
Yes.
And he wakes up every morning, and then Zeus is fathered by Kronos, and he's father time, and there's references to him eating his children as being part of like a time loop of our solar system.
Oh.
Even though I do think they're referencing the rebellion against the gods as well, it's kind of a double entendre. But yeah, it's very interesting.
And we haven't even gotten into the Garden of Eden. And
No.
who's the real good guys and bad guys in that story? And there's a lot there. And
there,
as you mentioned, Eden wasn't like copyrighted by Moses or something. That idea already existed.
exactly. And it's really interesting to see the differences, isn't it? Like in Sumerian, it's the Adamu, it's a race, and in the Bible, it's Adam.
Uh-huh.
You know,
It's
and
it's
then
clearly one influencing another, and yes, it gets very interesting when you look at where stuff comes from and what it used to be and how it got edited into what it was and what it is now.
exactly,
Um,
it's very interesting.
well, hey, Clay, is as you mentioned, we are kind of running out of time. I'd really like to thank you for being here and for telling us about these things. And I'd really like to have you back and do another show in the future.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for providing the forum for this theory, which I still have a lot of work to do on, and I'm really glad you inspired me to speak about it because, as you know, I was very hesitant at first. But I hope your audience can take the information here and run with it themselves. I mean, I'm not going to write a book about this or try and patent it or anything. I mean, I hope that through the hive mind we can crack the mystery of this device because I do think it's important and I do hold firm to my belief that those trying to categorize DNA are doing so for the purposes possibly of this device, and let's work together to crack this code. I think it's really important for humanity. Outside of that DNA concern, I still think it's very important for humanity. And thanks for having me on, man.
Oh, hey, more than welcome. It's my pleasure. I could listen to you talk about this stuff really all night, but unfortunately can't
Thanks,
be
man.
here all night. Um, so yes, again, thanks for being on. Folks, this has been The Weird Part. I am your host, Vincent Treewell. Thank you and good night.